Hello and welcome to another episode of the Small Agency Talk Show. I'm your host, Chip Griffin, the founder of Saga, the Small Agency Growth Alliance, and I am very happy to have with me two really good friends and two people that you've already seen if you're a regular viewer of this show. Karen Swim of Solo PR Pro. Welcome, Karen.
Hello, Chip. Thanks for having me again.
It is always great to have you here. No tiara this time, but I think we'll still have a lot of fun.
Yes, we will.
And our other panelist today is Patrick Rogan of Ignition HR, an expert in all things talent. Welcome to the show, Patrick.
Hey, Chip. Thanks very much. Happy to be here today.
So today, of course, we'll be taking your questions. We'll be talking about what's on our minds. We'll be talking about W-2 versus 1099 work for your agency. And all of that will be coming up right after this. I always have to play that just to get a little bit of energy going at the start of the show, you know.
I was over here kind of bopping around. I like it.
Yeah, nobody really wants to see me chair dance, but last week Brad Ferris and I came out of it, really, it was really scary, and I apologize to all the viewers who had to endure that last week, but. In any case, so before we start talking about other things, why don't we just share a little bit more about each of you for folks who may not have seen you on previous shows. Karen, Solo PR Pro, tell us a little bit about it.
Sure. Solo PR Pro is a membership organization for independent public relations professionals. Actually, it's really independent communications professionals because some of our pros are in social media, some do other forms of PR. So, and it's been around for over a decade.
Fantastic. Well, that will be a perfect perspective as we're talking about people working solo.
Yes.
And then Patrick, a little bit about Ignition HR and your background.
Yeah, sure. My background is human resources. Formed Ignition HR 5 years ago, so I've been around half as long as Karen in this capacity. So,
you've been around a lot longer than Karen.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, not to be ageist or anything.
Yes. So I help organizations with their people challenges. About half my business is with for-profit organizations, about a half my business is with nonprofit organizations. I work with PR organizations, so the agency space I'm familiar with. Lots of times I'll come in to fix a particular problem. Normally in the course of my activity, I'll do an HR audit. We'll look at some other areas. And essentially I help from a people process and technology perspective to get organizations sort of on the straight and narrow on the people side specifically. A lot of fun.
Excellent. Well, so I think that brings a perfect pair of perspectives as we're talking about something that I know comes up a lot of times when I'm talking with either solos, super solos, or small agencies, which is, the whole idea of 1099 in the United States or independent contractors in other countries and W-2 or traditional employment in other countries. And this is something that's becoming more and more complex. It's something that people have strong feelings about. It's something that the government in various states and the federal government here in the U.S. has very strong feelings about. And so, we've seen some changes recently that are really concerning, I know, to the solo community. So why don't we start there, Karen, and talk a little bit about what California in particular has done, but also there are some other things that are in the chatter, at least at the moment.
Yeah, so one of the problems with 1099 employees is that often the government never, can we just be honest, they never really understand the nuances of independence. And so an Uber driver, a gig economy worker is not really the same flavor of independence as somebody that's running their own public relations agency. There is definitely a difference. And so what's happened is that companies like Uber that have high visibility and really we all can see where, they've really kind of crossed the line into having drivers that really skirt what the definition of true independence is, and making them independent contractors because obviously it's cheaper for the company. They don't have to pay benefits and they can, grow and scale their business all over the world by using this model. But Are drivers really free to work for other companies in order to make enough money? They're often working, 80, 100 hours for one company. They're working exclusively through an app. Sometimes they may diversify by driving for one other company, but essentially they really are acting more like employees than independent contractors who are going out and soliciting their own contracts, managing those relationships, and handling the back end of their business. And so what's happened is states like California, and there's lots of look-alike legislation around this, pass things like AB5 and the PRO Act, which, and Proposition 22 recently passed too, where they're looking at, independent contractors as one blend, and they don't understand that some people really do choose to work as an independent, and they don't, like somebody like me, I don't need or want to be unionized, because more than an independent contractor, I'm actually a business owner. And many people that are knowledge workers feel that same way about their independence. They've hung out a shingle. Many of us are actually incorporated, so we're really not even technically freelancers. We hate that word. We're businesses. We're just smaller businesses or micro businesses.
Yeah, and I think that understanding, freelancers versus true independent businesses is part of the challenge here, right? Because I think you're right. Most of the people in your community do consider themselves independent businesses, but there certainly are people who do consider themselves freelancers that all of us have probably employed from time to time in one capacity or another. And so you've got that distinction, but then you've got, as you've pointed out, government that just does a poor job of understanding how the world actually works. And so, they're trying to address a high publicity item like Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, those kinds of things, coming up with a solution for that and not realizing what all of the unintended consequences are. And that's it's very concerning, certainly from the solo's point of view, but it's also scary from the employer's point of view. So let's turn to Patrick for a moment on that. I mean, from an employer's perspective, if I'm a small agency and and I'm trying to figure out, okay, I want to get some additional help from someone on the outside.
Mm-hmm.
They'd like to be hired as a 1099 because they're perhaps a solo that I'm partnering with, and so they've got an independent business. I mean, how do I judge as the employer if this is a safe thing to do, or if I'm just going to get myself in trouble with California or whatever state that may be relevant to me?
Well, that's a great question, Chip. And I think, Karen, you kind of hit the nail on the head when you were talking about Uber and their cost savings being a motivation in terms of how they've set themselves up. And I think the first thing that I look at when I'm advising a firm in terms of establishing an independent contractor relationship is, so why are you doing this? Is this simply a way of saving money? If it is, then you might want to take a look at, well, there's a whole host of other things you need to take into consideration. If, on the other hand, this is the way someone just prefers to do business, and there's a certain litmus test they kind of fit, then you really shouldn't worry about it too much. But in general, things to work out for, like, that are going to get a lot of scrutiny is, let's say you have an employee who's doing just fine, and the employee decides that he or she wants to all of a sudden switch over to an independent contractor. So they're essentially doing the same job they were doing before. You're just paying them differently and avoiding FICA co-pays and income taxes and all those kinds of things. If that's your motivation, then you probably are going to get into trouble. If, on the other hand, this is an individual who works for multiple organizations over, let's say, the course of a year, who has his or her own equipment, who bills out on a regular basis, typically monthly, whose terms are probably net 30 days, then that's probably going to make the sniff test in terms of, yeah, this is an independent. The key is the word independent, right? And if they're really tied to your organization, if they come to your office every day at 8 a.m. and they leave every day at 4 p.m. and you do performance reviews for them, then you know what? That's an employee. So I think those are kind of the guardrails and motivations that I think kind of help organizations.
Right. And the example that you just gave is probably one of the dumbest things that any employer can do, taking someone who is currently an employee and then turning them into a contractor. And it's tough because there are actually sometimes legitimate reasons why the employee may want to do that, right? They may be
Yeah.
leaving. In fact, I've had this where I've left an organization, and so then they've wanted to hire me to do something somewhat related to my old job while I was doing other things as well. And so, you know, that's very risky, though. That's something that you generally want to avoid because it is so easy for the government to figure that out because of tax ID numbers. They can
Yeah.
say, oh, you were a W-2, now you're a 1099. Let's go take a look at that. Um, but I think, Karen, one of the things that Patrick has raised here is this idea of, if you're independent, if you're invoicing, you're working for other people, you're marketing your business, you tend to pass the sniff test. And I think that's generally the accepted position that most people took over the last 20 or 30 years. Certainly since I've been in
Yeah.
business, that's been the rough guidance. But as we look at what California's done and what other people are doing, there's one piece of this that makes this more challenging because they talk about how you can't contract out things that are basically the same thing that your business does or that other employees within your business do. And so that's where I think, particularly in the agency space, it tends to make people nervous that they're going to get tripped up on that piece, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's interesting because I see people violate the sniff test all the time, and I step in to
Sure.
like educate them that a- as a as an independent, you also need to know the rules so that you can ensure that your clients are compliant. Because you can't have a client treat you like an employee. So you can't have a set of hours that you're supposed to be doing work. Part of that whole sniff test, and here's, taking a step back, part of the problem with why we're seeing, this tension in the marketplace and with the government right now is because there really has been no single clarification and true guidance on what qualifies as an independent. You have a patchwork of laws and regulations that can vary from state to state. So it does make it very confusing. Right now, the Department of Labor has issued a guidance on that, and I think it's still open for public comment. Um, but it's been difficult because there's not like one rule, and so people have defaulted to the rule of the definition of an independent by the IRS standards is that you are holding yourself out to market yourself for other clients, that you are free to do your work as you see fit. So when somebody hires you to do a job, they can't then say, well, you need to be at our office from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Monday through Thursday, because that is not the definition of being an independent. And I think that sometimes companies struggle with that because they don't understand yet how to think of work in terms of projects, which really is the evolution and the future of work, is not to think of it in terms of job descriptions, that in my viewpoint are often meaningless, but instead of thinking about what needs to be done and what's the expertise that we need to apply to that. Because when you think about it in those terms, it makes it a little bit easier to understand that you give people the flexibility to apply their expertise without controlling how they get it done. So, it's a problem on a lot of fronts. I work, full disclosure, with a client, MBO Partners, and one of the things that they've been advocating for that I love is something called self-certified independence, where there is, one sheet that you can sign or certification that you can say, I understand these rules. I choose to work as an independent. And then your certification says to employers, and it protects them because the government accepts this certification that you understand, and this is what I want to be. I don't want to be in a union. I don't want to have benefits. I want to run my own business. And now they have that clearance because you've already agreed to these rules. And I love that because it gives the control back to the independents and doesn't penalize people for choosing to work this way because they're lumped in with Instacart and Uber drivers.
Right. Well, and I think fundamentally that's been one of the problems historically is that there are a number of independent contractors who go into it and they don't understand what that means. And so I can't tell you the number of times over the years I've talked to someone who was, a 1099, and they didn't realize that it meant that they were supposed to be paying estimated taxes, and they didn't understand that, that it had other ramifications that they should be thinking about. Um, from an employer perspective, Patrick, I think one of the concerns that people have had, in addition to saying, okay, if I use 1099s, I can save money, which, by the way, I think is ridiculous. I mean, if you're actually hiring legit 1099s, they should cost more than an
Yes.
actual in-house employee.
Yeah.
In fact, usually you sit there and say, okay, if I'm using more than half of a contractor's time, I should have that role in-house because it will be more cost effective. But so we'll set aside that very common but nonsensical argument that they make. I think another reason, though, that people use contractors is because they're worried about the complexity of having employees. And I think this is particularly for someone who is building out their agency. They haven't hired either many or any actual full-time employees, and so they think that there's this real burden to bringing on employees. But it's not as bad as it seems, right?
Well, it depends, right? I mean, in terms of, so I'm working with a client right now that is small. They only have 9 employees, and of the 9, 7 are independent contractors. And when I had a conversation with the CEO in terms of, so what is your motivation for that? Her perspective was she didn't want the risk of having all of those employees. And she felt that by hiring them as 1099s, she was mitigating risk. So that was her whole thing. And after I educated her a little bit in terms of, well, actually there may be more risk. Let's talk about their roles and what they do and how you're structured and where they work and those kind of things. All of a sudden it was 180 degrees. It was very, very risky, and we're another place very quickly. But I think a lot of it is from an employer perspective, you really need to think through, if you're going to hire a 1099 consultant, an independent contractor, what is your motivation? Why are you doing this? And when you have that down, you can, there's people like me and plenty others, Karen, I'm sure you can help as well too, in terms of guiding them through the process of, well, wait a minute, let's just go through this little checklist and make sure that you're not opening yourselves up to undue risk. Now, neither of us offer legal advice because that's not what we do. This is that's a whole different thing. But we can still talk.
None
about
of us are lawyers. We're not accountants, so don't.
Right?
This
Yeah.
is
Let's
tax,
just get that clear.
legal,
Yes.
health. It's not. It's just idle opinions.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I think that ultimately any kind of thing that you do as a business owner carries some degree of risk. So hiring full or part-time employees carries risk, 1099s carries risk. You need to evaluate your specific circumstances and figure out what the right solution is and understand what those risks are, because there's nothing that's risk-free. And I think you've aptly pointed out there that there are certain roles that it's very dangerous to try to turn those into 1099 positions. There are other times where it's much easier. I mean, if you're going to hire a graphic designer to do a logo for your business, that's a pretty easy one to be able to justify contracting out, right? The odds of getting in trouble for that are a lot less than if you've got a 1099 who's your receptionist, for example. Those would be 2 very different cases.
Or a salaried employee who's your receptionist. I wish I had a nickel every time. No.
Yes.
That doesn't qualify. They need to be hourly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and that, I mean, that's a good point too. I mean, even within employment, there are different classifications
Yes.
that are evolving, and I suspect may get a fresh look. A number of years ago, there was an attempt to change classifications of exempt and non-exempt
and that's still in
employees here
play.
the U.S. Yep. And so that's something that certainly agencies will have to be looking at. But so Karen, how is your community responding to all that's going on now? How are they seeing that it's impacting their businesses directly? I mean, I've heard anecdotally that a lot of consultants in California are having a really hard time because people are just gun shy about hiring anyone.
And you're absolutely right.
Even if they're not based in California.
even if they're not based in California, people that dealt with California clients definitely experienced some fallout because, just as you said, employers just got a little freaked out about doing the right thing and decided to just dispense with using contractors. Sadly, so we as a community have really had to step up and do a lot of education. Because again, many of our solos are businesses. They are incorporated. So they're S corps or C corps, and they're not even really truly, the only thing that's independent about them is that they work on their own. And sometimes they have, an assistant, or they contract with people here and there. So it's really helping to educate people. But for some of the, employers in California, particularly New York is another state that can be, just a legal minefield. They make everything more complex in New York. Sorry, New York, but you do.
Mhm.
So yeah, and that's not fair, right? To treat people who are really operating as a business and following all of the rules and that are compliant, to say, well, we're just not going to hire you because of what's happening with Uber. It makes no
Hmm.
sense.
Hmm. Now, I mean, one of the things that obviously happens is some of the solos or super solos are hiring other solos. Have you seen any concern, ironically, within your community of people being concerned to hire other solos to work with them?
I haven't, because I think we understand intimately. I mean, that's my whole business model. I work with contractors. My whole team is contractors, and I do that because it's a flexible model. And then I can, have hours here and there and apply them to clients as needed, so it works for me. And a lot of our other solos do the same thing. You'll note that there's a lot of stories coming out right now, and MBO Partners' latest State of Independence in America study showed this, that teaming is one of the key strategies that independent contractors are using. It's, again, it's really being smart about the type of resource that you need. Some of our solos have, evolved to actually hire employees. Why did they do that? They did that because they wanted to have control over the employee, and because it was a core part of their business. So it wasn't something that they wanted to outsource because it was central to what they were doing, in their own agencies. And some of those are social media agencies. Some have moved on to become really more traditional PR agencies. And so I think, knowing the law for yourself is equally important. And, as Patrick said, really understanding your business case for the type of resource that you need in your business.
And I think flexibility is a huge piece of this. And I think particularly in the times in which we live,
Yeah.
over the last year or so,
Right.
because so much is uncertain, and so the more flexibility you have, the more you can hopefully grow your business in an intelligent way. So, Patrick, if I'm a small agency owner and I come to you and I say, look, I need flexibility, that's why I'm using contractors. How do I do this without getting myself into more trouble than it's worth? I mean, what would your advice be to someone in that situation who really
Yeah, I
wants to
would
go down
say
that path but is nervous?
I would say first of all, be very careful. And the reality is, it takes a lot more than to have the right intention or motivation to end up at the right place. The expression, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I see that I see that all the time. So you have to take a step further and understand that if the individual who's going to be working for you, is going to be really a part of your organization, is going to be a part of your culture, is going to be someone who you envision working the preponderance of their time for you over a long period of time, and they're integral to your organization, then you really ought to take a hard look on if that person should be an independent contractor or an employee for more than just compliance reasons. It may very well be, if that is someone that you're investing in and they're investing with you, maybe it's important for your organization to have that be more of a permanent relationship. That may just make sense from a business sense. It totally takes care of everything from a client's perspective. On the other hand, there may be particular areas where you need skills that come to the table, and that need then goes away, and it doesn't make sense in investing into a permanent resource for someone to do that. So in that case, the other makes sense. But in either case, I think it makes sense to get a little bit of help. If you have an HR person on staff, or if you have access to an HR consultant or someone who knows something in the space, you can just, it takes 10 minutes to kind of go through, this is a person I want to bring on board. This is a capacity I want to do it. Does this sound all right to you? It's a very easy, and bear in mind, like Karen was saying earlier, it differs drastically by what state you're doing work in and where an individual resides. So, get a little bit of extra help and just make sure. I think that goes a long, long way. And but it does need to fit where you're going as a business as well too. Does that make sense?
It does, and I assume you would suggest, very clearly documenting the process that you go through. So have a checklist or something like that says
sure.
This is how we're making our decision, and then collect the appropriate information and hold on to it in case you ever get audited somewhere along the way. So that
and
you can
review
decide
it over time, because keep
Correct.
in mind those relationships can change over time. So review it over time and make sure you're still in bounds versus out of bounds. And oh, by the way, if the regulations all change, double check them too.
Well, there's that too,
true.
and I think it's tough because particularly where you're dealing with something like this, where so many states have so many different standards, and so trying to be on top of that, particularly as we all use more resources that are in different geographic locations. It's so easy to do that now as we have the technology available, as people become more comfortable with video. Those geographic boundaries that we're used to have been completely broken down. And so you have to know what's going on in California and New York and Illinois on both sides. You have to know it as the contractor because it's going to impact potentially your business, and you have to know it on the employer side because it's certainly going to impact yours.
Yeah, I know on the employer side, I was reading earlier this week, there was a survey that is showing that about a third of employees, just because of COVID, obviously, the employer actually doesn't know where they're working, which is scary. Definitely, contractors, not as important. Employees, very important.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Your insurance agent really wants to know the answer to that question too, because
For sure.
it may impact your business insurance policy
And your payroll
depending
vendor and everything else.
Well, yeah, exactly.
I mean,
So-
but the good news is that there are lots of ways to get help with these issues today. I mean, you can work through an organization and run your accounts through them so that you know that you're in compliance, and then you can be a W-2 of that organization, and your client can send their payments to them. I mean, so there's, thankfully an infrastructure has arisen to support true independence. As Patrick noted, hiring HR people is so much easier than it was 15 years ago. There's lots of, small agencies that are HR companies that will support you, or that you can just buy some consulting hours from to help with these issues. I mean, attorneys too, and I think, I always say invest in your business by getting expert help. One of my pet peeves is the DIY culture, where everybody thinks that they can learn everything from YouTube and Google, and you spend 100 hours trying to figure stuff out and piece together information when you could have just paid somebody that actually knows what they're doing and does it all the time and get the right answers. Because I think people minimize the risk. If you are found to be misclassifying employees, you could lose your entire business. You could just lose it, because God forbid that happens. And it doesn't just affect that one employee. So you could have an employee or a contractor that has worked for you for 2 years. And now you say, you know what, our needs have changed and we, no longer need you. And that person, innocently goes out and files for unemployment. And then they come to you and now they do an investigation, and agencies cooperate with one another. So now you're in a pickle because you got to prove this. And if you're found to have misclassified this person, well, they had an email address from your company, and, they worked for you for, 35 hours a week, and they really didn't have any other clients. They'll go back in history. And so, then you're forced to pay them back benefits and everything that they're owed. And I don't know a lot of independents or micro agencies that could afford that. It would just kill the business entirely. So it's not a small thing. it's really important to make sure that you're compliant for your sake and also on behalf of your clients.
Yeah, no, you're spot on there, and I talk to too many agency owners who, take the "I'll ask forgiveness, not permission" approach on this and many other things, but this in particular, as you point out, is particularly dangerous because once they do find that first problem, they will start applying things retroactively, and they will expand it beyond that one individual, and there are countless examples of this where, depending on the state, they may go back 5 years and try to capture all of the, not just the lost tax revenue, but also all of the lost benefits and compensation and other things that those individuals may be entitled to. So you do want to be very careful at the front end of this and not just say, well, I'll deal with it, deal with it if it ever happens to me. And I think, just you said that the importance of the resources that are out there, and I would certainly encourage folks, if they are solos in the PR and marketing space, certainly you should join Solo PR Pro because it's a great resource. I know that Karen, you were very much on top of this. It's where I had first heard about AB5 because it's something that you've been tracking so closely. And so I know that that's the kind of thing that you help the solo side with. And if you're not a solo, if you're a small agency, then Patrick or someone like Patrick who has expertise, whether it's an HR consultant or an employment attorney, you should absolutely be working with them on not just this aspect of your employment policies, but all the aspects, handbook, terminations, hiring, all those things, because there are a lot of minefields out there. And, Google and YouTube are your friend. This is being broadcast on YouTube. Hopefully we've provided some good non-advice but information over the last 30 minutes, perspectives, shall we say, opinions. It still is not the same as having someone who's well-versed in all of the laws and regulations that apply to your business in whatever jurisdiction you're in. So I certainly encourage that. And so as we wrap up here, I guess I would just ask each of you sort of, pull out your crystal ball and where do you see things headed on all of this? I mean, are we in for a rocky period where it's going to be even tougher, or do you believe that things will sort of rationalize and we'll be in a happier place from an independent contractor standpoint? So, Karen, I'll start with you on that one.
I'm so super optimistic about the future. So I definitely think we're going to be in a happier place. And I think it's actually going to be accelerated by this pandemic because you have had so many people remote work. And then you have people that have really become digital nomads because they have switched locations, which there's some problems with that too, and in the way you do that. But so I think that large enterprise, once they sort of get on board with adopting, a hybrid workforce and understanding that you can have, employees and that you can also have contractors, and that it actually makes you better and it gives you more agility and flexibility in your workforce, that helps to drive the laws and to drive some clarity. So I think it is going to get better.
So you believe we're going to see the promise of the gig economy fulfilled,
I do.
the positive aspects
I do.
of it?
I'm an optimistic girl, though. So,
Patrick, do you share that optimism, or are you going to be the typical HR Debbie Downer for us?
Well, I have worked in HR for almost 30 years, so I'll be not quite as optimistic, but I am optimistic that over the past year, we've been able to really flex a muscle we didn't know we had in terms of our ability to take advantage of remote working. And I do think from a large perspective, our opportunity will be greatly enhanced on a go-forward basis. Short term, I think we do have some compliance challenges we're going to need to be very, very careful with, both at the state and local level, as well as probably certainly at the national. I'm certain that the Biden organization is taking a hard look, and I think there are going to be changes that we're going to need to be aware of. But I think as we're aware and cautious, I think we're going to be fine. And I think the net is things are going to continue to grow and expand, and we're going to have resources we didn't think we had before. How's that?
And I would be remiss if I didn't throw on my political and public affairs hat, since that's how I got the start in my career. And I would encourage you, if you're listening to this, and if you're a contractor or you're an employer and you have strong feelings on the direction that things should be headed in. You should share that with your elected representatives. You should comment on the regulations during the public comment periods that are available in both the state and federal level, because it's only if we educate the policymakers that we'll ever have a chance of getting the right rules and regulations in place. So I'll get off that soapbox, but I had to say that. I can't help myself. So,
No, good reminder.
So with that, Karen, Patrick, this has been a really great conversation. I'm sure people have taken a lot of value out of it. I really appreciate you coming back. I haven't scared you off yet. Hopefully I still haven't scared you off, and I'll be able to get you both on this show again very soon. But that will bring to an end today's episode of the Small Agency Talk Show. You, of course, can find all of the previous videos at smallagency.tv, and you can join the Saga community for free at smallagencygrowth.com/join. So with that, I would wish everybody a happy weekend. We will be back here next Friday at noon Eastern Time for another live show, and we'd love to see you back here then. Thanks for joining us.